until we're able and willing to have serious conversations about our past, I think the likelihood that we'll have quote unquote racial reconciliation is going to be challenging. Even as you look at, many of the churches, there's a movement around having diverse churches, quote unquote. This recent set of activities politically have torn many of those apart. And I think it's unfortunate. But there's a lot of work to do, man.
Hey, podcast family, and welcome to episode number 290 of the L3 Leadership Podcast, where we are obsessed with helping you grow to your maximum potential and to maximize the impact of your leadership. My name is Doug Smith, and I am your host, and today's episode is brought to you by my friends at Bare Tongue Advisors. If you're new to the podcast, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here, and I hope that you'll enjoy our content and become a subscriber. And if you've been listening to us for a while and we've added value to your life, it would mean the world to me if you would leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or whatever app you listen to podcasts through. That really does help us to grow our audience and reach more leaders, which is our whole mission here at L3 Leadership. So thank you in advance for that. Well, in today's episode, you'll hear my conversation with Dr. John Wallace. For those who may be unfamiliar with Dr. Wallace, let me tell you a little bit about him. He is a Pittsburgh native, born and raised in the city's Homewood neighborhood. He is the vice provost for faculty diversity and development at the University of Pittsburgh, where he holds the David E. Epperson Endowed Chair, and he is a professor with appointments at the School of Social Work, the Katz Graduate School of Business, and the Dietrich School of Arts and Sciences. He is also the senior pastor of Bible Center Church located in Pittsburgh's Homewood. Over the past 30 years, Dr. Wallace's work has focused on the well-being of African-American children, youth, and communities. He's the principal investigator on the University of Pittsburgh Center on Race and Social Problems COM University of Pittsburgh Project, an integrated program of research, teaching, and service designed to investigate social problems that disproportionately impact economically disenfranchised African-American communities. Dr. Wallace is ranked number 5 for scholarly productivity among African-American faculty at the top 25 schools of social work. His research has been funded by a variety of national and local sources and published in numerous professional journals, books, and monographs. In addition to being a professor, a pastor, and social entrepreneur, Dr. Wallace is also a husband and a father. He's been married to his wife, Cynthia, for over 32 years, and together they have 4 adult children. So as you just heard, Dr. Wallace obviously has quite an impressive resume, but what's even more impressive than his resume is who he is as a person and who he is as a leader. And in our conversation, you're going to hear him share his story. You're going to hear him share about how he's literally transformed a neighborhood and transformed our city and how you can transform your city. We talk about racial reconciliation, and we also talk about diversity and inclusion. And then, of course, we take him through the lightning round. There's so much rich conversation in this episode. You are going to absolutely love that. But before we go into the conversation, just a few announcements. This episode of the L3 Leadership Podcast is sponsored by Bare Tongue Advisors. The financial advisors at Bare Tongue Advisors help educate and empower clients to make informed financial decisions. You can find out how Bare Tongue Advisors can help you develop a customized financial plan for your financial future by visiting their website at baretongueadvisors.com. That's BERATUNG advisors.com. Securities and investment products and services offered through LPL Financial, member of FINRA and SIPC. Bare Tongue Advisors, LPL Financial, and L3 Leadership are separate entities. I also want to thank our sponsor, Henny Jewelers. They're a jeweler owned by my friend and mentor, John Henny. My wife, Laura, and I got our engagement and wedding rings through Henny Jewelers, and we just loved our experience. Not only do they have great jewelry, but they also invest in people. In fact, every couple that comes in and gets engaged, they give them a book to help them prepare for their marriage, and we just love that about them. So if you're in need of a good jeweler, check out hennyjewelers.com. And with all that being said, here's my conversation with Dr. John Wallace. Enjoy. Well, thank you, Dr. Wallace, so much for being willing to do this interview. And why don't we just start off with you telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. Primarily, I'm a Head Start kid from Homewood, for those of us from Pittsburgh. But I'm also a pastor, Bible Center Church in Homewood. I'm also a professor at the University of Pittsburgh, and I'm also a vice provost at the University of Pittsburgh. And probably most importantly, I'm a husband and a father of 4 adult kids.
Yeah, and we were together recently and you were sharing your story with a group of young leaders. Can you just share a little bit about your story and your background? I think it would be very informative to our audience.
Sure. So I was born kind of in the mid-'60s here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My grandfather's father was enslaved. And that just reminds me of how recent the issue of chattel slavery was in America. And that's important to me when I think about the progress that I've been blessed to make and the standing on the shoulders of giants in my family. Unfortunately, my dad dropped out of high school because his dad died when he was like 16. So he had to take care of his family. And so between my grandfather and my grandparents and my own father, education was hugely important. So I was absolutely encouraged to pursue education. Was blessed to go to a Christian school throughout my high school years and elementary years, and then went away, left Pittsburgh in 1983, never to return, but funny things happen. So fast forward, I found myself back in Pittsburgh in 2004, been a professor at the University of Michigan and graduated from there, and went to the University of Chicago undergrad, and got married shortly after graduation from undergrad. I had a wonderful church where we attended. My wife and I helped launch a Christian school at our church. I was a young adult pastor there, and then came back to Pittsburgh, like I said, in 2004, pastoring the church. Became a professor here at Pitt. I was a professor at Michigan before I came here. Had been studying the role of congregations in community development and community transformation. As a part of my research agenda at Michigan, taught a course called Holistic Faith-Based Development and looking at the role of congregations, specifically doing research in Detroit and looking at the ways in which congregations were instrumental in developing low-income communities, largely African-American communities in particular. And for whatever reason, kind of passionate about the topic, and then moved here to Pittsburgh and had written a little bit about the work and actually had a blueprint in many ways that we have followed in the work here in Pittsburgh, in the Homewood neighborhood in which I was born and raised, and being able to leverage my research and the teaching, and started an organization called the Homewood Children's Village, co-founded that with a colleague, and just been able to do a bunch of interesting and fun and exciting work that marries my vocation, avocation, and a sense of commitment that I have based on the opportunities that I've been blessed with to be able to hopefully be a blessing and benefit to others and young people in particular. So I'll stop there.
Yeah. So obviously you did research on what it takes to transform a community, and then you actually did it. And, I would love to hear you just dig
Whoa,
deep.
this past tense thing you're using here is like, nah, man, very much in progress and trying my little piece of the world, chipping away. But no. We're not going to make it bigger than it is.
No, I love that. So you're in process of transforming a community, and that'll be never ending work, I'm sure. But I would love to hear you talk to leaders about how they can and what you've found works in transforming a community. But before you dive into that, can you just talk about what you've actually set into place to transform your community in Homewood?
Sure. So, I mean, the base of our work is our church, our congregation, our faith community. When we came back to Pittsburgh, we were 12 adults, one teenager, and we just started looking around and seeing what we could do. And so the first thing we started was just picking up trash. So for like 2 years, every Saturday for 2-3 hours, picking up trash and knocking on doors and passing out stuff to just build relationships. So batteries, toilet paper, you name it. We were just out connecting with the community. But also just looking and identifying what are the specific challenges, right? Contextualizing the needs and opportunities in our own community. And then marrying that with kind of best practice research on how does one address these particular challenges. And then, of course, the driver behind that is my faith and just the sense of hope that things can be better. And so my work is really rooted in what we commonly call the Lord's Prayer. And so the disciples had asked Jesus how to pray, teach us how to pray. And so he starts, it's in Matthew chapter 6, verses 9 and 10, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. And then the kind of punchline verse, your kingdom come. And the question like, well, what does that mean? Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And so I'm just captured with this concept that when we pray, we ask God that his will be done here on earth like it is in heaven. And so the question that motivates our work is, what does making things look more like heaven, what does that look like? And so I don't exactly know what heaven looks like. And, even if heaven is real, but there's this notion that there's a better place, right? And so when I look at a situation and I ask myself, does that look like God's will being done
Wow.
on earth like it is in heaven. And so each of the things that we do, and so, we have a transportation company that was started because young people in Pittsburgh and the East End, when Peabody High School closed, some of you be familiar with it, when it closed, those young people's feeder pattern school was Westinghouse. And so that means those young people are walking from East Liberty through Lincoln Larmer through Homewood to get to school at 7:30 in the morning. And again, for your listeners who are familiar with those neighborhoods, that's some pretty challenging terrain. And that doesn't look like God's will being done on earth like it is in heaven. So we started a little transportation company to transport young people through that space and to get to school on time. Similarly, we have a coffee house. Again, the research suggests that third spaces, coffee houses, things of that nature, creating places and spaces like that, put eyes on the street, creates a sense of a place of gathering. We call our work the Oasis Project. So an oasis, a place of peace and safety in the midst of challenge and difficulty. And so the transportation company, the coffee house, an entrepreneurship academy. We have a cleaning company. We have a commercial kitchen, so a shared use commercial kitchen. So food-based entrepreneurs can have a place where they can actually grow their businesses outside of the little home kitchen, right? So fully licensed and all the equipment folks need, that sort of thing. What else? We have a pretty expansive program for kids called the Makers Clubhouse. And so, the maker, you get it. But the Makers Clubhouse is a place for young people to be exposed to, world-class instruction around STEAM in particular. So science, technology, engineering. Our A is sometimes art, but agriculture is the main thing. So teaching kids about growing food and mathematics. Again, we found out the kids in our community were not being exposed to science because of the emphasis at that time. The policy was No Child Left Behind. And so the emphasis was on reading and mathematics, which meant that the kids were getting science like as a special, essentially 9 weeks over the course of the whole year. And we know that science, of course, is the integration of reading and math. And people who ultimately go on to be scientists, they generally are exposed to science and fell in love between like third and fifth grade. Wow. Well, if kids aren't getting it then, and then you fast forward to the high school a few years back, none of our kids were proficient in science. And again, you found out part of the challenge was they didn't have science instruction. And so now when you think about the role of technology and the well-paying jobs in our society, all of them are rooted in science. And we find that our young people, African-American, low-income kids like myself, were not exposed to science. So we're shocked when you fast forward a few years from now and they're not doing well in science. Exposure, opportunity, and even having an instructor, a teacher, these opportunities denied. And so much of what we do is really, if I'm honest, is seeing myself as a 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 8-year-old, 10-year-old and doing for others I wish it had been done for me and our family. So that's a lot of the work, kind of the big picture of it.
Yeah. And I think, especially young leaders, I think we all want to make a difference with our lives. We all want to transform our communities. And it's a great thing to want to do that. But again, you're actually in process of doing that. And it sounds like, as I listen to your story, you really just said it. Hey, you thought about yourself as a 5, 6-year-old and just said, what would have I wanted? And that's what you created. You also identified needs within the community. And I'm just curious, if someone's looking to transform their community, would you recommend them, going door to door? How can they really discover needs that will actually be transformative versus just what they think will be transformative?
Yeah, so of course there's the issue of collaboration, right? Who are partners? But for me, I think there are two things. What makes you angry and what makes you cry? Those are two usually things that motivate us to act. It's something that bothers us, right? That makes us angry or it breaks our heart. And at least for me, in my experience, those have been the things that motivate me to act. When I see something that looks like an injustice, that motivates me to act. So when COVID-19 hit and we're thinking about all of the kids in our community who don't have Wi-Fi, whose parents are essential workers and they'll have to go out and work. And so the kids, many of them would end up at home by themselves. So we launched this program, which we call the Neighborhood School Strategy, created to help optimize online learning because we knew that kids in our community would lack access to these opportunities. And so we juiced up the Wi-Fi at our church building, in our sanctuary, literally, bought some tables, chairs, and used our staff and hired some additional coaches and so forth. And so we had 54 kids over the course of the entire school year who we got them online, made sure they were able to do their homework, to submit the homework, like you know how kids are, right? I did it, but I didn't quite send it in, and now you got to email it, and it's a whole nother complexity. And you know, we had like 84% attendance, which is probably as high or higher when the kids were in school, and we provided meals over the course of that time. And between April 16 and today, we're actually up to over 190,000 meals that we've delivered to kids, you know, all over the region. Again, seeing needs and opportunities, being in some ways angered by that, and then being motivated to act. So for young leaders, I would say part of it is in community context is learning to exegete the community, right? Learning how to read the community, knowing what the challenges are, knowing what the needs were. So one of the things I did even before I moved back to Pittsburgh, when I knew I was coming back, I looked online at the Trib, the Post Gazette, and the Courier to get a sense of what is the city of Pittsburgh doing, what is the Homewood neighborhood where I knew I would be moving, our ministry work and as well as the academic work would be, and just learned about the community from a distance. I mean, and the technology permits that. And then when we landed, a lot of it was conversation, like talking to people, finding out what are the unique challenges and needs, the aspirations of the community. And so really there's a huge learning function. And then again, as a person of faith, additional piece of that was just prayer. Like, okay, God, this is overwhelming. Where to start? What piece is this to jump into? And then finding partners and collaborators and people who are different than you are and who have complementary skills, and building team, you know. And then of course you have to identify resources. And so our first set of resources, like I said, were garbage cans and garbage bags, and then building slowly. And again, learning and listening a lot as you go. I mean, so one of the things that I've learned, and one of my favorite and most powerful teachings was from my grandmother. She said, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth. Right? Translation, listen more than you talk. All right, I'll be quiet.
That's awesome. Yeah, well, I love what you shared, and because I think sometimes people can see, you know, the work that you're doing at now, but they don't realize, you know, you had small beginnings too. You started
Came out of nowhere 17 years ago, right?
Yeah,
17 years worth of hard work, and boom, you came out of nowhere.
I mean, that's what it can seem like. And so, you know, young leaders, if you're listening to this, I just want you to be encouraged. It's going to be a journey. It's going to be a process. And, you know, don't look at someone like Dr. Wallace and say, I want to be where they are next week. It's not going to happen. It takes time. So just keep being faithful.
Yeah. And it's important to talk to seniors. I think to talk to older folks and get their wisdom. And I think the thing is, and I'm certainly guilty of this too, as a child of the internet, and someone, you know, because been nested in colleges and universities forever, have had access to these tools in some ways before, you know, either before others. But being clear that, you know, the internet is information, but it's neither knowledge nor experience, and certainly not wisdom, right? And so access to information and maybe knowledge, but certainly not wisdom or experience. And so I think wisdom and experience are things that as a young leader, it's important to not believe that just because I can Google it and get some stuff, it's certainly not the same as experience or wisdom. And so I think it's important that we continue to be in conversations, particularly with those who have been where we're trying to go.
Yeah, and I'm just curious, you know, throughout your 17-year journey, you know, were there times you wanted to quit? And, you know, I think about young people starting and they could get discouraged with their small beginning. You know, what have you learned about, you know, wanting to quit and pushing through anyway?
I don't know. I think that I may have some personality stuff, but again, I think this is a result of observing and being taught. So I used to work with my dad and my grandfather, especially in the summertime. You start a project, so, you know, did a lot of manual labor. So doing a roof, doing plumbing stuff or whatever. But the notion of quitting, now you have to know when to do something different. I'll say it's fine to pivot, but the notion of quitting is just, that's not on the agenda, man. It's like, and particularly if you feel that, you know, you've been given some kind of divine direction on some stuff, that you just stick with it. And so much of, I feel like what we've been able to accomplish is simply because we wouldn't quit, you know. And again, you need to know when to pivot, and there's nothing wrong with something not working, right? So I would say I'm very optimistic, and that, again, that may be temperament or personality or something, but sticking with something, tenacity, I think is a huge part of success, is not letting go. And again, if there's something you really want to get done, being willing to shift and change, but to stick with it, and again, not that everything has worked, because it hasn't, not by a long shot. But, I think being tenacious and sticking with stuff is hugely important, because none of the quote unquote success that we've had has been overnight by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, and I'd be interested to hear you talk about money, just in general. I'm assuming you didn't get into this work because you thought you'd, be a billionaire one day.
No. Not at all.
But we live in a culture where, I think people want to make a difference, but they also want to make a lot of money. And I think that's a huge temptation for especially a lot of young leaders today. Can you just talk about, when it comes to pursuing and making a difference in your community, how have you viewed money throughout the course of your career?
Sure. Yeah. Money is a powerful tool. And I think it has to be respected. And more than anything, it has to be stewarded. It has to be managed. Money has to be told what to do. You have to understand money. So learning and reading about money and talking to people about money and not being greedy, because money, it's fleeting. It's a cruel master, but it's a tremendously powerful tool. And you need money, but even more than money, you need favor. You need relationships. You need wisdom. But it's a powerful tool, and I have a strong respect for money. But learning how to manage it and have as much integrity with money as humanly possible. I mean, I don't play games with the money. You manage the money well, and you discipline yourself. And so, in our case, we're totally debt free. And I've used the ability for resources to be available. That to me is a sign to move forward, because if there are no resources, and again, coming from my faith perspective, and others may not be there, but for me, where God guides, he provides. And if there are not resources, either that means not right now or no. And, there've been certainly some things that we've done that the resources haven't been fully available. And so, I'm like, okay, no. But again, and that doesn't mean you don't do anything, because my thing is you start, you get started and see what happens.
Yeah.
And if the resources, I mean, this, you operate in a not-for-profit space.
Yep.
That, hey man, if you're willing to work, and people like to invest in winners too. So you got to win. You got to win. But man, money, you gotta learn about money. I mean, one of my favorite money related books was Rich Dad Poor Dad, and people may think differently about it, and and again, some of the philosophy is not fully aligned with my faith, but there are some basic principles around money and around wealth creation, and an entrepreneurial mindset, I would say, is probably the most important aspect of money management. It's like, how do I take these resources and how do I multiply them, right? So the law of sowing and reaping still works, right? You plant one kernel of corn, you don't expect the kernel to pop up, right?
Yeah.
You're expecting the stalk with many ears of corn and many kernels, right? And then of course being generous. And that's at whatever level that you're able to be generous. But again, for me, it begins with a tithe, 1/10 of what we earn, and giving that away. And for me, that's to my faith community, and then offerings and other things, finding things that you believe in and giving them away. And again, I believe that the law of sowing and reaping is just real. I believe beyond the shadow of a doubt, when you give, it multiplies and it will come back to you.
Yeah. You talked about generosity. I'm going to transition in a second, but for those listening who just heard everything that you're doing in Homewood, and they would be interested in learning more about your work, or maybe even want to give to your work, where's the best place for them to go check out what you're doing?
Yeah, it's offering time. We can do that. So,
yeah, let's go.
There are 5 ways to give here at Bible Center. I mean, so there's Venmo, there's Cash App, and all of the handles are BCPGH. B is in boy, cat, C is in cat, PGH Pittsburgh, at BCPGH. So Venmo, Cash App, Tidely, however you want to do it, we're out there. But I appreciate the ask.
yeah, and we'll include links to all of your everything you're doing in the
show notes. Say in the show notes. Yeah, man, I love that when they say the show notes.
You'll be in the show notes. I want to transition and talk to you a little bit about racial reconciliation. Obviously, a big subject for a long time, but big emphasis over the last year and a half. And I'll just leave this open-ended and see where the conversation goes. But what would your encouragement be to leaders when it comes to helping make the world and racial reconciliation look more and act more like the kingdom, as you mentioned earlier? Sure.
So, I mean, it's interesting. The language you use was reconciliation. Generally means over. And I would argue that in many cases, there hasn't been conciliation. And so reconciliation is probably premature.
Wow.
I think that this is a space and place, and again, this is probably only a conversation that I can have in light of my faith, because I think the church is the one place where we should be able to address these issues and have, the difficult and hard conversations, because our nation has never really addressed the fact for 246 years, Black people in America were enslaved, which means being totally cut off from the economics of our nation other than producing wealth for other people, right? So not allowed for the most part to form families, unable to own property, people literally being killed for attempting to read, right?
Jeez.
And so we fast forward to today and we talk about where things are and what people should be doing, but you can't ignore, because the nature of wealth creation is compound interest, right? I call it the eighth wonder of the world, compound interest. So for 246 years, people denied access to wealth creation. Then you add another 100 years of Jim Crow, which was legal policy that precluded people, again, from being able to. You think about when slavery ended, do you really believe that people who were formerly called masters were like, oh, okay, so now you're free, and that 300 acres of land that needs to be harvested, that 100 acres, that 10 acres that needs to be harvested, it's all good? No, man, you got to be kidding me. And so the wealth of this nation built on free labor, and we ignore that reality and want to pretend like the world just began yesterday, and we talk about equality and equity, or want to point to a couple athletes or entertainers or whoever and be like, what? And we had a Black president. Like, are you kidding me? We're talking about macro structural issues here. And, people all into critical race theory and all that. We don't even have to have that conversation. Let's just talk about critical truth theory. 246 years of slavery, man. People were owned and could not own and were not remunerated for their labor. That is so antithetical to the American story, right? This whole idea of bootstraps. People didn't have boots, let alone bootstraps, right? And so when we ignore that and then want to act like all is square today, I don't understand that. It doesn't make sense. And the math certainly doesn't work with the expectation that what we observe as wealth gaps and so forth, that they exist. That math won't work. The wealth gap will never be eliminated. It can't, because the math won't work. Again, compound interest, and the ways in which wealth multiplies over time, and the fact that people are denied access to wealth and the levers to wealth can't be ignored. And then when we add our faith, there's never been a collective reckoning, even by the church, around race and some effort to restore those gaps and the ways in which our churches, and we're seeing how many of our universities, of course, as we know, were founded as seminaries, but built either by slave labor or folks who were under remunerated, or people who were even either formerly slaves or people who were incarcerated or whatever. And so the foundation of our nation being built on slavery, and our ignoring that, and then we fast forward and pretend like it's all good, or that was the past, so let's forget it. It's not that simple, man. It is not that simple. And the level of ignorance, frankly, that all of us have, because our history, much of what is purported to be history, has been propaganda, right? We have to be honest, because the intent was to give us a particular view of our nation. But true history, we like our own personal histories, right? We need to be honest about our path and where we've come from. And, we're absolutely a great nation. There's no question about that. But we have a lot of stuff in our past, as do all of us, that we've never reckoned with. And the church, from my perspective, should be the place where we have conversations about what is genuine conciliation and then reconciliation. If we get to that point, what does that look like? So I think we have an inordinate amount of work to be done. And I really feel like the church should be the entity to lead that conversation and to model what it looks like. And I'm sure you've seen in the Southern Baptist Convention recently addressing these issues, or attempting to address these issues, and all the drama around it. And even the way in which our politics kind of spills over into that, and the massive differences between people of faith and different races, of even how they vote, and how, rather than us having what I call a kingdom worldview, right? Your kingdom come, your will be done. We find ourselves in these boxes called Democrat and Republican. I don't think that works if your faith is your driver and your priority. So until we're able and willing to have serious conversations about our past, I think the likelihood that we'll have quote unquote racial reconciliation is going to be challenging. Even as you look at, many of the churches, there's a movement around having diverse churches, quote unquote. This recent set of activities politically have torn many of those apart. And I think it's unfortunate.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of work to do, man. But I appreciate the questions.
Speak to the individual leader who's listening to this and maybe they're just getting educated. What would you encourage even me, as an individual? How can I be part of the solution?
I think it's reading relationships, right? Educating ourselves about our history and not expecting, in this case, we're talking about race, not expecting Black people to educate you because that's not fair, right? Things that we really want to learn about, we do. So read in relationships and then reach out to people and begin having conversations. And then, it has to be genuine, man. And again, that's where the fact of the matter is most of us don't even have cross-racial relationships, and particularly our white colleagues, simply because they don't have to, right? When you're in a numerical majority, by definition, you find yourself in a position where you don't have to be inconvenienced or stretch to get to know people of other races, right? Yeah. Particularly as we think about employment and stores and so on and so on. And so for people of color, Black people in particular, and if we're talking about here in the Pittsburgh region or whatever, the onus is often placed on the numerical minority to do the outreach and the educating and so forth. And that's not fair, right? So I think the thing is relationships and education.
Yeah, I read Miles McPherson's book, The Third Option, which I thought was great. And he talks about getting into your out group. We're always in our in group. Do you have any advice for leaders on maybe they don't have any diverse friends and they're like, I don't know.
Wait, now, there's no such thing as a diverse person. People are who they are, so there's no diverse friends. You talking about Black, you talking about Korean, you're talking about Puerto Rican, say what you're trying to say. But then, yes, they don't have any friends who are different than they are.
Thank you.
And I don't know where one starts from scratch, man. Maybe you just find somebody on the street or something. I don't know. It's folks in your church, folks at work, but they're contact. But you have to make the effort. You really do have to go above and beyond, and being willing to sit in discomfort. And I think that's the challenge that many white folks are not. And here's the thing. They don't have to sit in the discomfort. That's the reality. Right. And I think this is the challenge when we even think about diverse groups, the ability to withdraw and say, I'm not going to engage that. I'm not going to do that. I don't want to hear that. That's the power of it, that you can just walk away. Right. But if you're going to engage, then being willing to engage and be willing to actually listen and hear. And you don't have to take it personally or whatever, but you do have to be willing to be comfortable in the discomfort because, again, particularly in the Pittsburgh region, so as an African-American man, I'm often the only person in the room, in large rooms full of white folk, right? I have to deal with that as a regular part of my reality. Given the nature of your work, you may find yourself probably in much more diverse spaces than many, but how often are you the numerical minority or the only white guy in a room, right? It's probably pretty seldom.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been in those situations, and again, I was uncomfortable, and it was just like I've never experienced that before, and it was a very humbling experience for sure.
Yeah, and the question I ask you is why? Why were you uncomfortable?
Because I was the minority, and it was like, yeah.
But think about it. That's most of the African Americans. That's probably their daily reality, and so imagine if your whole life was this space of discomfort.
Yeah.
Again, so I think we miss it, and when we're in the numerical majority, we don't understand the challenge that the numerical minority has to live with.
Yeah. So that's the individual, and I'm just curious, if we move to organizations, and what organizations, whether it's a church, nonprofit, for-profit, what can they do collectively as a leadership group or as an organization to be part of the solution? Do you have any advice there?
Yeah, well, again, you have to remember that organizations are still groups of individuals. And so when you as a business are hiring folks, or when you're subcontracting out, right? So my uncle said something to me years ago. He said, listen, son, one of the most powerful social welfare programs there is a job, right? Because when people work and they earn their own resources, they get to choose where they eat, what they drive, their insurance, all of that stuff. And so the freedom that comes when we've invested resources. So as a business, consciously thinking about where do we spend our money? How do we spend our money? Do we do business with the same folks that we've always done business with, or do we go out of our way to find folks who don't necessarily look like us, where we can invest our resources, right? So when you're getting a catering order, Panera's is great. I love Panera, but maybe you find that local place or that local caterer or something like that. So thinking about consciously, how do we spend our resources? What sort of things do we support policy wise? Who do we advocate for, right? Internships. Do we make opportunities and spaces and places to invest in communities? Anything education related, right? Do we adopt classrooms or do we work with folks who are in those spaces? So thinking about decisions that maybe we would take for granted otherwise, right? What banks do we have our retirement in? I mean, all of these things, particularly economic decisions, I think are hugely important. And those are things that businesses as corporate entities can do, hiring and asking about our culture. Do we have a diverse and welcoming culture? And if not, why not? And even these notions, when we think about qualifications, most of us are comfortable with people like us, right? And so even the questions that we ask for folks who are quote unquote qualified, questions about fit, right? But we know that it is in diversity that there's creativity, there's innovation, right? And so it's not, of course, not just racial or gender, but diversity of thought, of opinion, and of experience actually is advantageous for us as a company, right? So again, being willing to stretch and be uncomfortable in order to improve circumstances, situations, and frankly, if nothing else, but for our own self-interest, but being willing to accept and acknowledge critique and challenge. So
Yeah, well, thank you for the challenge there. We have about 9 minutes left, so I want to transition into what I call the lightning round, which is just a bunch of fun questions that I ask leaders during interviews. And the first one is, what is the best advice you've ever received and who gave it to you?
well, I alluded to the advice from my grandmother, right?
Yeah.
God gave you 2 ears and one mouth. That's a good one. I have another one. I mean, I had a realtor tell me when we were talking about this house and, loving this house. She was from the South, thick accent. And she's like, John, don't love nothing that don't love you back. And I said, you know what? That's powerful,
Yeah.
man. So the fall in love with material stuff, whether it's a house or stuff, that would, to me, was one of the most simple and powerful pieces of advice I've received. So I've always kind of remembered that.
If you could put a quote on a billboard for everyone to read, what would it say?
Don't love nothing that don't love you back.
Come on, there it is. What's the best purchase in the last year you've made for $100 or less?
Oh, it might be this multi-headed adapter charger thing.
Oh, nice.
I can do them all from this thing right here, man. It's amazing.
What are one or two books that have made the most significant impact on you in your life?
First and foremost is the Bible. I recently reread 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Very powerful, particularly in, as you get older, you see things and read them differently. But the communication chapter, seek first to understand and then be understood. So I would say that definitely, as I revisited it, has been hugely powerful. I mentioned Rich Dad Poor Dad. Again, I think a lot of people feel funny about that, but in terms of just the clarity and the simplicity of the instruction, I found that to be helpful. Right now, I'm going through 4 habits. The 4 disciplines or something.
We'll just call it 4 disciplines.
Yeah.
We'll put a link to it in the show notes. Had to drop it in the show notes on you.
Yeah, I think that's Covey's kid, right? The 4 disciplines of execution.
Yes, boom.
Yes.
There it is.
Yeah, it's good. That's a good book.
What do you wish people knew about your journey that they may not know?
That I'm an introvert. Yeah, and so I think people think I'm extroverted because I talk a lot, but I'm really not.
Yeah. But we were just talking before the hand. You may be coming out with a podcast. Is it too soon to throw this out there? All right. We'll move on. I'm curious. You meet with a lot of leaders. Do you have a question that you always ask when you're in a leader you want to learn from?
I like to ask people, what are you passionate about?
I'll just turn that around on you. What are you passionate about?
Oh, man, you can't ask me my question. I'm passionate about people identifying and then walking in their passion. I really get excited, especially with young people, when they discover how God created them and what he made them to be and do. Because I think when people have a passion, they get up in the morning excited. They look forward to the day and they realize that they're gifted and talented and so forth. So I love helping people figure out How have I been created? What are my unique gifts, talents, and abilities? And then what domain, what sphere am I designed to influence to make more like heaven? Right. So my personal hashtag here like there, earth like heaven. What piece of the earth, what little piece of the earth, in fact, am I supposed to make look, feel, be more like heaven?
Love it. What's your biggest leadership pet peeve?
It's probably when leaders take all the credit for stuff. It's like, you got to be kidding me, right? Because if I know for a fact that I'm not that guy, right? I'm good on vision, but the detail stuff, so not me. So when you see leaders act like, and again, we do that as society. We like the idea of the lone wolf, the hero, and all of that, but it's like, nah, man, we know better than that. So, yeah.
Do you have any unusual habits that have made you either successful or productive?
And yeah, it's probably not an unusual habit, but I like to read broadly. So I like to read outside of my field. And I think I think I have a vision gift, be able to see into the future and to see possibility.
Yeah.
Again, I kind of characterize that as the way that God sees me. It's like, it's not where you are today, but this sense of where the person can be in the future. And the same thing even with projects or vacant properties or whatever, the ability to see things into the future, what they can be. So not what they are today, because, all of us are messed up. But the idea that there's significant potential in all of us, and that if someone is willing to draw it out of us, we can do so much more and be so much better.
What is something you've experienced in your life that you think everyone should experience? It could be a bucket list item, anything.
One of the most impactful things was going to Elmina Castle, the slave castle in Ghana, and understanding, first of all, people being brought across the continent, sometimes hundreds of miles, no shoes, shackles on, and then being held in this castle that actually, I forget if it's Elmina or the other one, but it's under a church. And so the way in which religion has been abused and used to justify the maltreatment of people, and then the Middle Passage and all of that. So to realize how real slavery was and the loss of human life, and again, how in fact much of the world benefited from chattel slavery, and how the slavery that Europe and America undertook was different than the slavery we read about in the history and even in the scriptures. The fact that people were treated as subhuman, and it wasn't because of war or because they owed debt or whatever, and the things that we see in the scriptures, but the fact that it was purely for economic gain. I would say that the slave castles to me was something that it just opened my mind to the reality of something that I had only quasi read about and certainly hadn't been taught about.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. And
absolutely.
I know you mentioned you don't have a bucket list, but is there anything that you want to experience that you haven't yet in your life?
No, I mean, I'm in the short run. I just need to go to a beach, man. I've been locked in the house for a long time. So I just need to go look at the Atlantic.
Come on. Last two questions. If you can go back and have coffee with 20-year-old, I don't know if he was Dr. Wallace at that time, but 20-year-old.
26. Not until he was 26.
Okay. So 20-year-old John, what would you tell him?
Yeah. Eat right and exercise. Or maybe that's what I would tell 56-year-old John.
I was going to say, when did the current John realize that? Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's probably not what actually 20-year-old John was actually in decent shape. That's hilarious. That's a great question. I would probably tell him to just read broadly, which again is something that I do. But I would say learn about business. I think that's also hugely important. Just an entrepreneurial mindset, and to always be optimistic, and to thank people, and to be a positive force, right? When you come into a space, be upbeat, be pleasant. People should want to be around you, and believe, just have a sense of hope, but it's not just the aspirational hope, but the sense of faith attached to hope that things can and will be better, and that you can make a difference. I think that's the messaging that, you can make a difference. And that's so powerful, man. When you realize and believe that you can make a difference, you can. You may not be able to do it all by yourself, but you can make a huge difference in the world. And so I would say that would be one of the kind of encouragements I would give to 20-year-old me.
Yeah. And last question, on the other end of your life, when you reach the end of your life, what do you want to be remembered for? What do you want your legacy to be?
That guy made his little piece of earth more like heaven.
Come on. That's awesome. Anything else you want to leave leaders with before we wrap up?
Young leaders, I would say, as you find mentors, make sure that you add value to them. I think oftentimes, and I certainly have done this too, you are often in take mode when you're a young person and you don't realize the question you should also ask to your mentors, like, how can I add value to you? What can I do to help you? How can I serve you? Because there should be reciprocity in relationship. And again, I think sometimes young people, I'll say for me, when I was younger, I probably didn't give back enough or acknowledge enough what the leaders that were investing in me were giving to me. So a reciprocity there. And particularly now, I think about like social media and other things that older people, would greatly benefit by, having some mentoring and frankly, you could build the relationship and invest back into people, right? So I would say don't just be a consumer or a taker, but also give back now while you're a young person. And you have freedom, and I would try stuff too. You're young and you just make small mistakes, right? But you have a pretty decent window of time where do stuff, try stuff out, figure out who you are and enjoy life, man. Enjoy life. Yeah.
Well, Dr. Wallace, thank you so much. This has been a rich conversation, and I know it's going to add value to a ton of leaders. So thank you so much.
Cool. My pleasure.
Well, hey, leader, thank you so much for listening to my conversation with Dr. John Wallace. I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did. You can find ways to connect with him and links to everything that we discussed in the show notes at l3leadership.org/290. And leader, as always, I want to challenge you that if you want to 10x your growth this year, I really want to challenge you to either launch or join an L3 Leadership Mastermind Group. Mastermind groups have been the greatest source of growth in my life over the past 6 years. If you're unfamiliar with what they are, they're simply groups of 6 to 12 leaders that meet together for at least 1 year in order to help each other grow, achieve their goals, hold each other accountable, and to do life together. So if you're interested in learning more about masterminds, go to l3leadership.org/masterminds. And as always, I like to end with a quote, and I'll quote Tim Keller today. He said this, he said, "If someone is criticizing you, and the criticism is mostly mistaken, identify the 20% of the indictment that is fair. Without excuse, be willing to take it to heart. Christians should be the ones most willing to repent." And I just love that. Well, hey, I hope this episode encouraged and challenged you. Laura and I love and believe in you so much. Keep leading, keep making a difference. Don't quit. The world needs your leadership. Go make a difference today.